Our scripture reading today is from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 5, verses 1 through 13. Nehemiah deals with oppression. Now there was a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish kin. For there were those who said, "With our sons and our daughters, we are many. We must get grain so that we may eat and stay alive." There were also those who said, "We are having to pledge our fields, our vineyards, and our homes in order to get grain during the famine." And there were those who said, "We were having to borrow money on our fields and vineyards to pay the king's tax. Now our flesh is the same as that of our kindred. Our children are the same as their children. And yet we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves. And some of our daughters have been ravished. We are powerless, and our fields and vineyards now belong to others." I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints. After thinking it over, I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, "You are all taking interest from your own people." And I called a great assembly to deal with them, and said to them, "As far as we were able, we have brought back our Jewish kindred, who have been sold to other nations. But now you are selling your own kin, who must then be brought back to us." They were silent and could not find a word to say. So I said, "The thing that you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God, to prevent the taunts of the nations and our enemies? Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us stop this taking of interest. Restore to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the interest on money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them." Then they said, "We will restore everything and demand nothing more from them. We will do as you say." And I called the priests and made them take an oath to do as they had promised. I also shook out the fold of my garment and said, "So may God shake out everyone from house and from property who does not perform this promise. Thus may they be shaken out and emptied." And all the assembly said, "Amen," and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Excellent. Thank you all for having me here today. My name is Eli Holiday. I'm an organizer with COPA, which is a broad-based organizing group from as far south as King City to as far north as Santa Cruz, with 28 member institutions, of which this church is a proud member and has been for many, many years. Of those 28 members, I would say about 20 of them, maybe 21, I'd have to check our membership rolls, but somewhere in that range are faith institutions. And as I've organized here and at our sister organizations in Texas, I've spent a lot of time over the last few years working with faith institutions. And one thing that I have seen happen, especially coming out of the pandemic, is that they're not as strong as they used to be. I know with COPA that most of our members have about half the weekly attendance that they used to, that their giving is down, that their engagement with the church is down. And had you told me that, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I would not have cared. I was not raised in a church. I was not engaged in a faith community. But as I've gone through this journey of organizing, as I've worked more and more with people of faith and people that want to live out the social values that faith entails, I now find myself in a position where that saddens me deeply, and it concerns me for the future. And what I really want to explore today is, my thoughts, not the gospel, but my thoughts on why that might be happening and what we can do about it. What are the steps that we might be able to take to repair that? And I picked Ezra and Nehemiah as the reading today because it tells the story of the Jewish people's return from the Babylonian exile and their process for rebuilding the temple. And even though, we have not been separated for 100 years, as the Jews were in the Babylonian exile, we have spent years in isolation now. And I would argue that perhaps for years before that, the culture of talking to each other and engaging with one another has been weakened over time. And so I think, though it's not a direct parallel, there are some lessons to be learned from how the Jews rebuilt their people and rebuilt their temple in the wake of a period of isolation and in the wake of a period of mourning. So this story begins not with Nehemiah, the titular character, but instead it begins with a guy named Ezra. And Ezra is the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. And I was telling Phoebe that I decided not to use that chapter because I didn't want to make her pronounce Artaxerxes. But Ezra goes to King Artaxerxes as a member of this Jewish exile community. And he beseeches him to say, please let me go back. Let me go back to Jerusalem. Let me put my people back together. And it's important to remember here, too, that in the Babylonian exile, we sometimes talk about it as if all of the Jews in Jerusalem were picked up and they were moved to Babylon. But what really happened is that some Jews were taken to Babylon, some were sent to Susa, some were sent to Persepolis, some were sent to all these other cities, and some stayed in Jerusalem. And so even more than picking up a community and moving it, what had happened is a community had been destroyed and scattered and isolated across the entirety of the Persian Empire. And so what Ezra was asking of King Artaxerxes was, let me put my people back together because we're destroyed right now. We don't exist. And after some months of deliberation, Artaxerxes finally relents to Ezra. And so Ezra is allowed to bring a cadre of Jews back to Jerusalem so that they can start the process of rebuilding the temple. And rebuilding the temple here is a physical act. It is the physical process of putting stones back in place so that the temple can be one building again. But it's also a spiritual and metaphorical act because the temple is the center of the Jewish community. And so by putting the temple back together, one thing that I've heard theologians say about this piece is that really this is two stories. It's the story of rebuilding a temple, and it's also the story of rebuilding a people, because that's what it takes to make this physical construction happen. So you have to engage people so that they want to be a part of it, and so that they can be a part of it. And it's hard. It takes them 2 generations to rebuild the temple. And at first, when Ezra sits down and starts this process, he begins really by basically going out and giving people some assignments to say, you go fix that, you're responsible for this wall. And it doesn't work that well. Folks come back to him and they say, well, those other folks on the other wall, they have the easier section, so that's why they're getting more done. Or, they screw off and they go do something else. But, broadly, it doesn't work. There is this real moment where the Jewish people realize that they aren't one people anymore because they had been laboring under this myth that they were still all Jews. But 100 years is a really long time. And so Ezra takes a step back for a moment and he says, okay, before we start this process of rebuilding the temple and really doing that, we have to figure out who we are and what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be a member of our community. So they start talking to each other and listening, and they do, in organizing, we'd maybe call them a house meeting, but basically they go into people's homes and they just start asking family after family, what does being Jewish mean to you? What does being Jewish mean to you? And they engage them in this way, and they start to form a picture. And this is where Nehemiah comes to the scene. So Nehemiah is, again, the titular character, and I believe one of the only people in the Old Testament who has a book named after him but is not a prophet, but don't quote me on that. And I raise that because what he does is really important. He takes some time to really think after Ezra goes out and does this work of listening to people about, okay, now that we know a little bit about what's going on, what is it going to take for us to rebuild the temple? And he starts by engaging the heads of families and the chiefs of the various tribes, and really just, again, re-engaging in this process of listening and putting in firm next steps. And one of the things that keeps coming up over and over and over again is that as families have gone into debt, they've had to sell their children into slavery to pay off these onerous debts, to pay the tax collectors and to pay for the rebuilding and to pay for all these different things. And Nehemiah himself is one of the people that has engaged in this sort of usury, right? He's one of the people that holds these loans. And so he calls together the whole community in a huge assembly, which is this section that we read today. And he says, guys, like, we have to do something about this, right? I mean, as we heard, we have children that are being sold into slavery. We have families that are being destroyed. If we want to be one people, then that means we have to hold the hands of those among us who are struggling. Otherwise, what's the point of being a community? So the Jewish people come together and they codify a set of laws to say, this is what it means to be Jewish. This is what it means to be a member of our community, and this is how we help the members of our community. And he brings back Ezra as sort of a return character here, who presides over the rabbis standing together, and finally the Jewish people are one again. And that allows them in the final books to finally finish the process of rebuilding the temple. But the thing that really stands out to me about that is that it takes them 2 years, 4 concentrated efforts, 4 concentrated strategies to go out and listen to their community and an assembly to really start to get to the place where they are one people again before they can begin the process of physically rebuilding. And I think that makes a lot of intuitive sense to me because I remember I came to organize through work along the US-Mexico border in Texas, where I worked with refugees from Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador in these huge camps in Dallas and in the Rio Grande Valley. And I remember while I was doing that work that conditions were not great in those facilities and in those camps. And I wanted to do something about it. I wanted to do something over and over and over again. But I was one person against this huge system and this huge bureaucracy. And so I found myself in a position where I felt isolated and I felt alone, and I had no idea what the next step was. And it wasn't until I showed up to an organizing meeting in Dallas where one of my first mentors, Elizabeth Valdez, gave a training and gave a talk about, like, what does it mean to organize power? What does it mean to think of a community? Why is it important to have people by your side? That I started to get it. And I realized that for me, the problem was that I had been laboring alone, that I had not a community of other people to work with and think with around this. And so I quit, obviously, and I went to organize with our sister organization in Houston. And I still hadn't quite learned my lesson, because when I arrived in Houston, I organized in Houston's 3rd Ward, which is historically one of the poorest, and it's an African-American part of Houston. And I showed up, and I tried to start rebuilding the temple right away, right? I went out and I started telling people, okay, gentrification is the problem in this neighborhood. That's what we need to do something about. So let's pull together a meeting. Let's get folks together to sit down with city council to think about how do we reduce housing prices in this area so that we can keep affording it. And unsurprisingly, it totally failed, and nobody wanted to show up, and I got kind of laughed out of the room by city council when I showed up with 2 people. And I realized in hindsight, my problem is that, like Ezra, when I originally showed up, I just immediately wanted to step into action. I immediately wanted to step into, there's a problem, this is how you fix it, and so that's what I'm going to do. Which is natural for me. I grew up on a farm, as I imagine many of you did. And on a farm, when something is broken, you don't stop and ask, okay, what do we think about this? You just go out and fix it. But that's not the way that this sort of rebuilding effort works. That's not what it takes to form a people. I realized that I had been very transactional. I was asking people to show up and do something for me, as opposed to engaging them in a relational way. These people that I was working with, I had no idea. I didn't know the first thing about any of them. So I dropped that for a while, and instead, and it was the United Methodist Church, I joined their men's group at this historically black church in Houston. And over the course of the next few months, instead of talking about issues or gentrification or healthcare or whatever, instead I just really got to know these people and engage with them and think with them about what is it that this community needs and what is it that we want to spend our time and our effort on. And Aristotle talks about this phenomenon. Aristotle is a Greek philosopher, and he says that there are basically 3 fundamental types of relationships. He says that there's the people you party with, the people that you want to go and hang out with, the people that are fun to be around, that you'll go out and get drinks with, or that you'll go to in the Greek world, you'll probably go to the forum and talk philosophy, which sounds terribly boring. But they're the people you party with. There are the people that you get things from. So, that's a relationship with like city council. I do this for you, you do this for me, we'll trade stuff back and forth, right? It's a very transactional relationship, which is, I would say, how how Ezra first approached the Jews as they returned to Jerusalem, and certainly how I interacted with the folks of Houston's Third Ward when I initially arrived. And then there's a third type of relationship, which he lifts up as the best, as the strongest. He says the third type of relationship are the people that make you better. These are the people that push you. He says they're not always very fun to hang out with because they critique you and they challenge you and they don't take what you say for granted. They want you to get better, and sometimes that is a painful process, right? To learn is in some ways to be humiliated because you're realizing, oh my gosh, I'm wrong about that. And so these are the people that really sharpen you and tighten you, and they help you think better, they help you be a better person. And I think what it takes to do the work of forming a people is that we have to be okay with that third type of relationship, because if you're engaged in a discussion around covenant, around what does it mean to be a part of our community, then you are engaged in a discussion around what are the values that we hold, what are the things that we want to lift up, who are the paragons in our community, and how do we want to teach those values. Historically, one of the roles of churches in our country has been that sort of formation. It was early churches in 1775 where a lot of the civil discourse around, do we want to rise up against Britain occurred. And then all throughout our history, churches have been the place where people oftentimes come together to really start to think about what does it mean to be a member of our community and to go at each other a little bit. Not all of these conversations are friendly and joyous, right? Sometimes you have to really create some tension with someone around what is the kind of world that we want to create together. But that those are rich, deep relationships, and that's what drives people forward, right? I love to go out with my friends. I love to hang out with those people. But, for me, the most valuable relationships I've had in my life are the relationships with mentors who have guided me and who have shaped me and who have made me into a better person and the man I am today. And without those sort of relationships, then our culture begins to stagnate. Civil discourse breaks down. And slowly, over time, we begin to lose what it means to be a member of our culture and a member of our community. And my concern is that that's what I see happening more and more. We're moving into a more corporate tradition around faith and around what it means to be a member of our community. I had a conversation a few weeks ago with someone who was looking to join one of our member institutions, and one of the things she said that really struck me is, I don't know that I want to do all of this, but I want to go to Easter and I want to go to Christmas, and so what should I give with that in mind, right? She wanted to negotiate a corporate contract with, this is the amount of time that I want to spend at the church, and that's not her fault, right? That's just the culture that we've created. But for me, what being a part of a community and what being a part of a church means is it means, I'm there. It's not about negotiating, that I'm gonna give for Easter and I'm gonna give for Christmas. It's that I am making a commitment to say, I'm gonna work with this, and I'm gonna develop relationships with Phoebe and with Bob and with other people in this community, and we're gonna shape what it means to be a member of our church together. It's not this sort of subscription-based model to faith. So let me finish that story about Houston. So after a few months of working with this church in Houston, what really came up over time is that, yeah, sure, gentrification is something that they were worried about, and yeah, sure, healthcare is something that folks in this church were worried about. But the thing that they were really worried about, and the thing that they really spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to solve, is that this is the oldest black church in Houston, and the average age was 62. They didn't have new members coming in. They didn't have their kids and their grandchildren coming in. And so they were worried that they were the last generation of a historical black church, and that when they died, that history and that culture was lost with them. They wanted to be able to pass that on and teach it. And so instead of organizing some action with city council or some action with the mayor, what we did is we just organized neighborhood walks to go out and talk to the young parents in the community and to talk to their kids and their grandkids, much like Ezra organized, and just to say, what's going on with you right now? What does your life look like? What do you want out of a community? And what we heard then surprised me. We heard many, many people, especially young parents, felt isolated. They felt that they didn't have a community. They felt that they didn't have mentors. They felt that they didn't have a place where they could engage with other people outside of their work life or outside of their immediate family. In a lot of ways, what they described is that they didn't have a church, right? They didn't have a place to engage in forming some of those relationships. And yet, when we asked them, well, have you considered coming to Trinity United Methodist? It was like we were an alien at the door. It had never occurred to them, because I think one of the things that has happened over time is it's not just culture writ large that has lost this component of relationality and this component of engaging with people and asking them, what are your needs? I think our churches have done that too. As time has gone on, we have to keep the doors open. And so we also engage in a more corporate model. We also engage in a model that's based more on, well, how do we keep the people that we have, and how do we keep the lights on right now? Instead of really engaging in some thought to say, who are you? What do you want to do? What do you want out of your relationship with the church? Can we talk about this? Can we make the space for you to step in to a leadership role here, for us to think together about what the future of our community is? And when we started to make that offer, at first folks were a little bit hesitant. For many of them, they did not think of the church. They thought of the church as a place for their parents and their grandparents, not as a place where they could come into their own selves, and a place where they could step forward and really start to lead that. But as it became more clear that, and especially the pastor, that the space really was there for them to step in, to fill these leadership roles, and that the church wanted to think with them about what was going on in their lives and what was going on with their issues, that the church could be a place where we could have assemblies to talk about, why are we selling our children into slavery, and what are we going to do about it? Those folks started to come more. And unfortunately, I had to leave before that process was fully over. But when I left Houston to come here and organize with COPA, membership was up significantly. Services were significantly bigger. And even more than that, services were more lively. People stayed after for coffee to engage with one another and think with one another about what does it mean to be a member of Trinity, what does it mean to be a member of the Third Ward, and how do I develop and foster these relationships with one another. But that's hard, right? That is not the kind of thing that just happens overnight. You have to really make a concentrated effort to make that real. And even more than that, it's difficult to talk to other people face to face. I don't know about all of you, but I can say that for my generation, if I call someone on the phone, they don't pick up. They text me back, hey, what do you need? Forget an in-person, a face-to-face conversation or a sit-down. They won't even pick up the phone when I call them, right? And so if we're going to do this work of what I think it takes to really rebuild our institutions, it means talking to people, and it means being okay with, frankly, getting rejected probably a couple hundred times for all of us as we make these calls, and they don't pick up and they don't answer. But I think it's really important. When I think about my generation, the generation that's coming of age and going off now, what would usually be the next generation of church leadership, these folks aren't engaged. And the thing that worries me and the thing that I find concerning, not just for the future of our institutions, but for my peers and my colleagues, is that historically institutions like churches or labor unions or schools, that's where you find the mentors, the people that lead you, the people that guide you, the people that help to shape you, as Elizabeth Valdez, my supervisor in Houston, did for me. People that really challenge you and make you better, even though that can be a painful process. And as my generation is not engaged in our institutions, I'm worried that they're not finding those mentors, and so they're not going to be challenged in that way, or at least they won't be challenged as robustly. When I talk to my friends, my peers, my brothers, it's something that they crave. They want somebody to show them, how do you do this? How do you engage with the world as an adult, as somebody who's coming into the broader world, and yet they don't have those people. And so I think not just for the sake of our institutions or for the sake of COPA very selfishly, but for the sake of our future leaders, we need to take this seriously. We need to engage with these people. We need to develop relationships based on trust and understanding of their interests, so that we can start to foster some of this mentorship and some of these relationships. So I'm not sure totally what to do with that. Usually, if I'm organizing, I give people an assignment to say, go out and do it. But I know a sermon is a little bit different. And so one of the things that I want us to think about over the next few weeks is, what do you want to do? And what are you willing to do around this, right? It took the Jews 2 generations to put their community back together. And granted, COVID was not 100 years long, even though it felt like it. But I think for us to think that this problem is solved and that this work is done a year after the pandemic is over, it's just out of touch with reality, right? I mean, there is still so much work that needs to happen. And so what I want us all to think about is, what is your piece in this as a member of this church and as a member of this community? How do you want to engage people? What kind of relationships do you want to foster? Is there somebody that you really want to have a bigger role in the church, and can you go talk to them? Can you engage them in a way that is deep? Or if you're a new member here, is there somebody from the existing congregation that seems interesting, somebody that you want to foster a relationship with? Because if we don't take this seriously, then this could be one of the last generations of churches in the United States. But I hope it's not. And I hope that this work of relationality allows us to start to rebuild and become stronger, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, or a forest coming out of a forest fire. This is a moment to test ourselves, right? And to say, what does it mean to be a member of our community? That concludes my sermon.
Long.